Well, welcome everybody to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session in which I answer your science faith questions every Monday morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 12:30 in the afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. So again, welcome to Question of the Week. This week's question was submitted by my Facebook friend Ricardo Dominez, and Ricardo is asking about a common challenge to the Watchmaker argument for God's existence. He wants some help in how he can respond to a typical challenge made to the Watchmaker argument for God's existence developed by the British natural theologian William Paley. So we're going to be taking on Ricardo's question in this Facebook Live session. If you are interested in asking a question that you'd like me to consider for next week's broadcast, go ahead and post that question in the comments section of the Facebook Live session or the Facebook Live notes. Also, if you want to ask a question, you can private message me or even just post it on my Facebook page. All of those are options for you. Also, if you're listening to this live, go ahead and check in. Let us know where you're listening from. Say hi, that's always much appreciated. Or go ahead and like or respond to the Facebook Live session in any way that you would like. And then finally, if you disagree with something that you hear me say during the broadcast, please feel free to offer your dissenting comments in the comment section of this Facebook post. So anyway, without any further ado, let's go ahead and take on Ricardo's question. But before we do that, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork so everybody understands the context of Ricardo's really good question. The Watchmaker argument for God's existence, in my view, is a very powerful yet simple argument for God's existence. And by simple, I don't mean that it's a deficient argument, but rather part of its power comes from its simplicity. And this argument was developed in the late 1700s by the British natural theologian William Paley, who in his book, Natural Theology, argued that by analogy, if a watch requires a watchmaker, life must require a divine watchmaker. And what Paley points out is that a watch has a special set of properties that reflect the work of a human designer. It's composed of parts that interact in a precise way to accomplish a purpose. Paley coins a term, or makes use of a term rather, that I really like, called a contrivance. He argues that human designs are contrivances. And when he surveyed biological systems and what was known of those systems at that time, he noted that those systems are contrivances as well. And so he argued that if a watch requires a watchmaker, because life shares the same properties as a watch, it too must have a watchmaker, a divine watchmaker. Now, this argument, of course, hasn't fared all that well over the years, or at least that's the perception by many people, for two reasons. One has to do with challenges that David Hume leveled against the argument that are predicated on the nature of analogical reasoning, which undergirds the watchmaker argument. And also, there's the Darwinian challenge that a blind watchmaker can account for the elegant designs that we see in biochemical systems. Now, the idea behind Hume's challenge is this, that when you reason using analogies, the conclusions that you draw are only as sound as the similarity between the two systems that you're comparing. So Hume was arguing when systems are highly similar, the conclusion you draw is sound. The more dissimilar or the less similar they are, the less sound the conclusion. And so Hume argued, and there's others who have followed after Hume, have argued that a watch and a living organism are different enough that what we conclude for a watch doesn't necessarily apply to a living organism. Now, following on the heels of the Humean critique of the logic of the argument is, of course, the claim from an evolutionary standpoint made possible by Darwin's theory of evolution that mechanisms alone, natural selection operating iteratively on heritable variation, can produce the elegant designs that we see in biology. And so the watchmaker is blind. We don't need a mind to explain the elegant designs. So many people think the watchmaker argument basically is dead in the water because of these two critiques. However, in recent years, there have been remarkable advances in biochemistry that, in my view, give new impetus, new life to the watchmaker argument. And this has to do with the discovery of protein complexes in the cell that are literally machines in every sense of the word. They're made up of rotors and stators and drive shafts and bushings, universal joints, lever arms, and the like. Or we have proteins that interact with DNA that are literally Turing machines, that are the foundational machines in an abstract sense for how computer systems function. Or, as I posted last week an article on my Facebook page, the recent discovery of literally a biochemical watch inside cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. This is a complex that is formed when you have a ring of proteins that form from subunit proteins that form, again, a ring. And then in the interior space of that ring is another protein complex that has a scissors-like geometry that can be open or closed. And what happens is when the scissors opens, it makes contact with one of the subunits in the ring, causes a mechanical distortion that drives a phosphorylation reaction, adding a phosphate group to that subunit. And then once that happens, the protein will close, rotate, and then open again and repeat that process around the ring. And because of the reaction kinetics, it happens roughly in a clockwise manner. And it turns out that when all the subunits are phosphorylated, the whole complex dissociates, and this triggers regulatory processes in the cell that are responsible for the circadian rhythms, the oscillation in biochemical activity between light and dark in the cyanobacteria. But this is literally a mechanical watch inside this cyanobacteria that, again, is provocative in light of the watchmaker argument. Now, in light of this is where Ricardo's question comes in, because Ricardo's question kind of, again, represents a response to the watchmaker argument that kind of marries both the Humean and the Darwinian criticism. And this is what Ricardo writes. Let's see here. I really like the watchmaker argument, and I've used it. But there is a weakness in my understanding that if someone asked me, I couldn't answer. From an evolutionary point of view, the watch must have a creator since it doesn't have reproduction capabilities. Neither does it have ancestors. If a watch has those capabilities, then evolution could have generated it from simple parts to more complex parts over time, one generation after the other. To defend against this view in order to defend against this view, is there any way to compare a watch to an organism that would be created without reproduction? Or is there a better way to defend against this argument in which a watch has, again, no reproductive capabilities? So here we see, again, the Humean and the Darwinian criticisms being married, right? Because according to Hume, you can reject the watchmaker analogy because in this case, a watch can't reproduce, but a living organism can reproduce. And so on that basis, the argument would go, you can reject the watchmaker argument because of that dissimilarity, which is rather significant in the way that Ricardo describes. And of course, then if you're thinking about things in terms of Darwin's theory, if there's an ancestor to the watch, if you will, and that ancestor can reproduce and can be modified through natural selection, it can become greater and greater in its complexity and its elegance with respect to its design. Well, this is, again, a great question. And in light of this, I'd like to call your attention to work published a few years ago now by Paul Davies and Sarah Walker. These are two astrobiologists. Paul Davies is a well-known physicist that's taken up an interest in astrobiology. But Paul Davies and Sarah Walker published a paper a few years ago in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in which they argued that the way to think about the origin of life problem needs to be centered around the origin of biological information. And they highlight in this article basically the failure of what are called replicator first scenarios and metabolism first scenarios. And in fact, if you read their criticisms, they virtually are identical to the criticisms against these two origin of life models that Hugh Ross and I leveled in our book, Origins of Life, and also in my book, Creating Life in the Lab. But then Davies argues that the failure of these two approaches is really revealing the fact that origin of life researchers aren't asking the right questions about how life originates. And they argue that the questions have to center around the origin of information. Here they point out, and I would actually agree with them, that there are evolutionary mechanisms that can generate what they call simple information, or what we might call Shannon information or syntactical information, namely the sequence of amino acids or nucleobases in proteins or nucleic acids respectively that give that protein structure and function. They argue that that kind of information can be generated via evolutionary processes. I'm sympathetic to their argument, and I don't want to get into that in this particular broadcast, but they label this as simple information and argue that you can, even if you explain the origin of simple information, you haven't solved the origin of life problem, because the real problem is that life consists of matter that has information instantiated within the matter itself. And that information is telling the matter how to behave. In other words, there are instructions that are instantiated within matter, the matter of life. And those instructions take on the form of what's called algorithmic information. Algorithmic information is essentially instructions, a set of instructions. And the more complex something is, the more complex its structure, or sorry, the more complex something is, the greater its information content, the more complex the instructions are. Now, in order to build a bridge between algorithmic information and biological systems, they argue that the way to think about the cell is that it's a von Neumann universal constructor. This is an idea, an abstract idea that von Neumann developed as part of his work in robotics, the foundational work in robotics, in which he argued that a universal constructor, again, is this abstract machine that can make every other machine that exists, including itself. And he points out that this is exactly the way to think of a cell. A cell is a machine that can make other machines. All the machines we're talking about, the protein complexes, are the machines that are made by the cell. But that the cell also has this capability of flipping a switch, so to speak, and using those instructions now to make a copy of itself. This is the process of cellular replication. And so Davies and Walker are arguing that a cell is an analog to a von Neumann universal constructor. Now, this is interesting because a von Neumann universal constructor is a machine that can reproduce itself, right? And so instead of thinking of this as being a watchmaker argument for God's existence, we might be better off thinking about it as a universal constructor argument for God's existence, where we're comparing the cell to a von Neumann universal constructor, which is a construct that flows out of the brilliant mind of von Neumann. And so this addresses both the Humean critique, because now you could say a von Neumann universal constructor is identical to a cell, that the analogy is a sound analogy, and what Davies is pointing out is we don't have good explanations for the origin of life, either through replicator first scenarios, metabolism first scenarios, and as Davy and Walker point out, we don't know how algorithmic information arises within matter to essentially define life itself. And so this is highlighting that when it comes to biochemical systems, the Darwinian challenge also fails. So Ricardo, I hope that this helps you to respond to skeptics who bring up this particular challenge. I've seen this challenge quite often. This is a common challenge to the watchmaker argument, to argue a watch can't replicate, but an organism can. Therefore, the watchmaker argument is invalid. So anyway, if you want to ask a question again for next week's Facebook Live session, please go ahead and post your question in the comments of this broadcast. Or again, you can private message me, or you can just simply post something on my Facebook page if you like. And what I'll do is I'll look at all the questions and I'll find those questions that I think to be the most intriguing and also the question of the greatest interest and appeal, in my opinion, with regard to science-faith discussions, and tackle that question next week. Also, if you want to dissent, if you want to disagree with me, please feel free to write those comments in the comment section of this Facebook Live session as well. I enjoy reading alternate perspectives, and I want to make sure that my Facebook page is a place where people can discuss science-faith issues openly and in a civil manner. So I'm going to go ahead and close the broadcast down by leaving you with these words. The more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless you. See you next week.